Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria, please go to avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I'm happy to be joined by Joseph Pearce, our most frequent guest on the Catholic Theology Show. Glad to have you here.
It's good to be back. Thanks for having me, as always.
Right. So, as a author, writer, editor, publisher, speaker, teacher, visiting professor of literature at Ave Maria University these last couple of years, it's just so much appreciate all the work you've done to really help make the kind of memory of the Christian West available to us today.
Well, thank you. Obviously, it's a joy that I'm able to do that. I can't think of anything else I'd rather be doing in my life. So I have nothing but God to praise for what He's enabled me to do, and may He continue to allow that.
That's great. So today I wanted to dive into kind of a bit of history, but the English martyrs, right? This just moving stories of the English Catholics who carried on the Catholic faith amidst the persecution of the church, right? First by King Henry VIII, and then later by subsequent kings and queens, right? Especially Elizabeth, and right, just kind of maybe it's kind of a little bit of there's the amount of suffering and honor. Right, some of us, I think, hear about this, the song, The Faith of Our Fathers. You have a book with Ignatius Press, who's happy to be a special sponsor of this episode, Faith of Our Fathers, A History of True England. Right, maybe just how do we begin by by appreciating the great sacrifice and heroic courage of these English martyrs?
Yeah, so perhaps we can begin sort of somewhat philosophically, even though we're talking about history, with defining our terms. So the subtitle there, obviously Faith of Our Fathers, as you rightly say, is taken from the great 19th century hymn, but a history of true England. So the point is that for me, true England is the England that's remained true. In other words, true to Christ. So it's a history of the Catholic presence in England from the 1st century to the 21st century. But for me as an Englishman and as a convert to the faith, the part of England that I feel closest to is that people on a secular sense, well, it's when the England was furthest from the faith. In other words, Henry VIII's rupture with Rome, and then there's 150 years of executions, followed by another 150 years of continued persecutions, even when the execution's finished. So from the 1530s, when Henry VIII breaks with Rome, to 1829 Catholic emancipation, so almost exactly 300 years of persecution. Yet for me, the heroism of the Catholics in England, who, in spite of the persecution, in spite of the executions, exile, imprisonment, crippling fines for their recusancy, remain true to Christ and His Church. For me, they're the greatest heroes in English history, greater than Alfred the Great, greater than the great Christian kings, and they're the ones that I feel a particular devotion to, and I pray to them obviously often.
Yeah. I think you mentioned there are 40 canonized saints and 85 beatified, among these English martyrs. And so maybe just walk us through a little bit. I think many people know of Thomas More, perhaps the most famous, and St. John Fisher, who share a feast day. Right. Tell us a little bit about their story.
Yeah, so basically, as you rightly say, there are 40 canonized martyrs and 85 beatified martyrs. Many other martyrs have not been officially recognized by the Church at this point. But St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher, who right at the beginning are not actually included in that. They stand alone.
Okay.
They were canonized separately from the 40 martyrs, and they're not quite the first, because the Carthusians, friars were executed a few weeks before St. Thomas More, St. John Fisher, in 1535. So what we have, I think, with these two great men, we have one who represents, if you like, the hierarchy, the priesthood, because St. John Fisher was the Bishop of Rochester in Kent. And then you have St. Thomas More, who's a layman. So we have, if you like, both the ordained and the non-ordained English represented by these two men. And St. John Fisher, I think tragically, was the only of the English bishops that had the courage to stand up to the tyranny of Henry VIII. Everybody else kowtowed, capitulated, and that's one of the reasons that Henry VIII got away with it, because the lack of courage with the hierarchy at the time. But St. John Fisher was a noble exception. And for me, St. Thomas More, obviously I love both those saints, and we mustn't prefer one over another, perhaps objectively, but we can have favourites. St. Thomas More, I think it was hard of him, and I think this is a lesson for those of us who aren't priests, or for those of us that are, for that matter, that St. Thomas More saw that his family were being impoverished. They used his family to blackmail him. His lands were being given away while he was still alive, and to Anne Boleyn's family, to rub salt into the wound. And all he had to do was to capitulate, and because he wasn't just, if you like, ruining himself, he was ruining his wife and his children by taking this stand. But St. John Fisher was an old man and a bishop, and obviously a celibate, and I think had half his eye on heaven anyway. So not that it was easy, and not that I want to downgrade him in any way, but I do think that what Thomas More exemplifies for us is the staying true to Christ in spite of all the worldly reasons that we might have for compromising.
Yeah, we have an earlier episode of the Catholic Theology Show on the holiness of Thomas More with Thomas More scholar, Shakespeare scholar at Ave Maria, Travis Curtright. So I'd encourage listeners or viewers to go take a look at that episode to learn more about Thomas More. Thomas More is somewhat made famous, A Man for All Seasons, the Robert Bolt play, the movie. What would you say about that movie, if people have seen it, and how does it both maybe what are its strengths, but also what more do people need to know about Thomas More?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not an expert on film, but I think as cinematographically, it's actually a very good film in all sorts of technical ways. So certainly one of my favorite films I'm happy to rewatch. But Robert Bolt was not a believer, not a Christian, and I think he was an atheist. So we don't really get a sense of the Christocentrism of St. Thomas More's life that really motivated the sacrifice that he was prepared to make. It almost becomes sort of an individualist. It's about my rights as a person and against the state. It's almost about individualism versus the state, rather than Christ and Caesar and the love of the Christian for the Lord. So that's largely missing, and so that means the film is more shallow. The original play is more shallow than it might have been had Robert Bolt really understood the depths from which St. Thomas More was drawing in his faith.
Yeah, and we can see this in part through the work that Thomas More wrote, right? The Sadness of Christ, right? Meditating on, as he's in the tower suffering, he's writing about Jesus Christ suffering in the garden, and right, that's where he finds his strength, right? That's where he ultimately finds his consolation and hope. And it's interesting, one thing I always remember about that is that Thomas More prays for his own conversion, right? And his own fidelity, and just that beautiful sense that, yes, we should pray for the conversion of others. Yes, we should pray for others. But he doesn't spend his time lamenting Henry VIII's error and praying for his conversion, or lamenting the wayward bishops. He recognizes that actually staying faithful to Christ is a full-time job, and he really has to pray for that. He also prays for his children. He prays for others as well. But that's always struck me as a powerful lesson, that Thomas More, knew his humility and knew that he needed assistance and strength from Christ.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly as we were saying about what's missing in Robert Bolt, this humility, this relationship with Christ, this understanding, of the danger of Pelagianism, that basically we cannot defeat evil because we're good in ourselves. We don't defeat evil if God helps us. Mm-hmm. And if you're truly Christocentric, you're aware of that, and you're praying every day that you can do, you are able to do His will, and you're only able to do His will if He actually helps you to do it. By yourself, you cannot do it.
So last year, a couple of years ago, I went to first trip to Oxford and to London, And one of the interesting things walking around Oxford was that you really get a sense that all these colleges were founded by many of the religious orders in the 13 and 1400s, right? When England is Catholic, and so you get a certain sense this is really Catholic grounds. These are Catholic buildings, Catholic foundations. But then also went to London and went to, I think, Westminster Cathedral, and I think it was actually on the feast of Thomas More, and is that June 26th?
Yeah.
Or
it was June, late June. I can't remember that date offhand.
Okay, it might not be June 26th. It might be another day, but it's right around that. It might be June 24th.
It's June 20-something.
Okay, yeah, June 22nd. Anyway, around that time, we were there, and it was very moving. And I was talking with some of the young English priests, and one of them said, I was kind of like, it's sobering that out of 28 bishops, John Fisher was the only one who remained true. And the other 27, basically capitulated, and it's kind of like we ought to be very cautious about judging them because, they might have been, obviously they were afraid. They might have thought maybe they could do some good, all sorts of different things. But we look back and recognize that, John Fisher is the bishop that we'd want to emulate.
Yeah,
right.
We're not in a position to judge the dead, right?
Yes,
that's not for us. But we do know that St. John Fisher is in heaven.
Yeah. He's
canonized saint. We do pray for his intercession. We don't pray the other bishops.
Yeah.
We don't know where they are. We're not judging where they are, but we don't remember their names.
Yeah.
We don't pray to them, ask for their help. That St. John Fisher has the only reward that really matters, and that's to get to heaven. And he never lost sight of that. The other bishops, obviously, up to one point or another, they lost sight of that ultimate aim, ultimate goal of life is to get to heaven, to be united with Christ in heaven.
Yeah. So this young priest I was speaking with, he said, and the amazing thing, though, it was basically after losing everything, right? When Queen Mary comes back and tries to bring England back to Catholicism, she lets all of those bishops come back. She doesn't punish them. She doesn't, exile them. She lets them basically go to confession, repent, and come back. They, of course, are very chastised by that point. They're much impoverished. They don't own that much because most of what they had, the monasteries and so many things, were taken away and given to laymen and others. But then when the queen, whom he called Elizabeth the Tyrant, comes in and begins to suppress the Catholic Church again, he said this time, though, all of the bishops remain faithful except for one. Yep. So it's just the exact opposite. And so to a certain extent, what affluence didn't teach, suffering did. Suffering taught. And some of them were the same priests. Yeah. I mean, the same bishops.
Yeah.
Obviously, over like a 30-year period, but still, that they this time were faithful.
Yeah, because I think they've seen what happened. I think that if we want to make a defense for the bishops under Henry, they didn't really know how it was going to play itself out. Though that by the time he got to Queen Mary, they'd seen the destruction. They'd seen the destruction of the monasteries. They'd seen the tyranny of a king running rampant. And, of course, Henry's son, Edward VI, was a sickly child, and therefore basically all of his advisors that were really running the country were Protestant. And they banned the Mass. Edward VI, they banned the Mass. So, so obviously these Catholic bishops would be hugely relieved when Queen Mary becomes queen. Mm-hmm. Her reign is short-lived. And then Elizabeth comes to the throne, and they don't want to go back to the banning of the Mass, to more destruction of church property, to more tyranny by monarchs. So, yes, at this point, they've learned their lesson, and we're going to have to stand up for our faith irrespective of what it's now going to cost.
Yeah, and many end up in exile. Yep. And in different forms of persecution. So one of I'd say maybe after Thomas More and John Fisher, I think Edmund Campion is so well known, partly through Evil and Waz, a great biography of him. Tell us a little bit about Edmund Campion. What is his legacy? Just as in addition, I mean, as a saint, but also just as one of the heroes of this. trying to sustain the Catholic faith amidst persecution?
Yeah, well, two things. First of all, he's part of this vibrant Catholic Reformation, which is sometimes called the Counter-Reformation. Obviously, there's lots of great priests from this period. We have the Council of Trent, which is crucial. And one of the new movements in the church at that time are the Jesuits, right? Ignatius Loyola, St. Francis Xavier. And so within a generation, the Jesuits are growing exponentially, and that includes amongst young Englishmen. So Edmund Campion was a convert to the faith. Was absolutely a gifted, a prodigy. He won all sorts of awards at Oxford. He gave a speech in the presence of the Queen, the young Queen, and then has a conversion. And with the integrity of the man, he then goes into exile because you have no choice at this point. He studies for the priesthood, the Jesuit priesthood, and returns to England, knowing that if he's arrested, that he will be tortured and then put to a very, very slow death by hanging, drawing, quartering. So the courage of Campion and the other Jesuit missionaries that followed in his wake, really, I mean, we all should be on our knees in admiration and thanksgiving for the courage of him. And we have his famous brag, which basically says, we will win you back to the faith, even if you put us on the rack. Where our prayers, our martyrdom, whatever it takes, we're going to win England back. And yes, he didn't, as was the tragic case of many of the English martyrs, because of the spy network under Elizabeth and James afterwards. Many of them, because it's very easy to fake a conversion. Right, you're converted to the Catholic faith merely in order to become a spy. There's a mass somewhere, you hear about it, you go to mass, you report back who's there, who the priests are. And so Edmund Campion was arrested within a few months of arriving in England and tortured and ultimately executed. But he's one of my heroes, evidently, and those Jesuit martyrs of England. You have Jesuit martyrs in North America. They're early Jesuit. I mean, the first century of the Jesuit order is glorious.
There was part of a seminary, right, in the Douay Rheims.
Yep.
And which is some people are familiar with the older Latin or the older English translation from the Latin, the Douay Rheims Bible.
Yep.
And that was a seminary in France, correct?
Yep.
Where they were studying, and so that's where they would. But they were there knowing that they were going to go to England, and in many ways knowing they were going to go to die.
Indeed. So basically, Douay Rheims, that was really the new Oxford. So Oxford University was very Catholic and actually very defiant. So many Oxford dons, Oxford professors, just went across the channel to what is now sort of France-Belgium area and founded universities, of course, or colleges, I should say. And this college also became the seminary where people studied for the priesthood. Many others went to the newly founded English College in Rome. That was also founded at this time. And there was also an English college in Valladolid in Spain. So there are various places where English Catholics in exile could study for the priesthood and then come back to England. I got a wonderful example of Edmund Campion, by the way. St. Charles Borromeo, this wonderful Cardinal Archbishop of Milan. Well, when Edmund Campion came to England, they went overland. They traveled overland from Rome. So if you know your Italian geography, you head north or overland, you're going to go through Milan. So St. Charles Borromeo actually hosted Sir Edmund Campion and his companions. There were other priests with him on the way over and asked St. Edmund Campion to actually preach to him. So you have this wonderful archbishop with this newly ordained young priest, but actually in humility asking the young priest, because he actually could see these men were so faithful that they were going back probably to their deaths. And he was in awe of their courage.
So there are three women that are part of these martyrs. Tell us about a couple of them.
Yeah, so probably the best known of the three. So the three are St. Margaret Clitherow, St. Anne Lyne, and St. Margaret Ward. So the best known is probably St. Margaret Clitherow, who's the first to be martyred. She's sometimes known as the Pearl of York. So she lives in York in the north of England. And she, again, was a convert to the faith, was a mother, and sheltered priests, facilitated secret masses, was absolutely defiant. And her because she was a woman, they didn't hang law and quarter her, but she was sentenced to being crushed to death. So what this entailed, and it was said that she was pregnant at the time. I don't know whether that's pious legend or not, but she certainly was martyred on the Feast of the Annunciation, which is March 25th, which is glorious in itself. But basically, they stripped her naked. It wasn't a public execution. They were at least decent enough about that. They put a stone behind her shoulder, between her shoulder blades, and then they just put heavy weights on top of her until basically her ribs collapsed. It took about 20 minutes for her to die, bloody and what have you. So, but she's a great favourite of mine, obviously. And then St Anne Line and St Margaret Ward were both in London. And St Anne Line sheltered priests, and when they charged her, she didn't deny it. She said, where I sheltered one, I could have sheltered 1,000. And you love that courage. And then St Margaret Ward helped a priest escape. Got the trust of the jailer and smuggled in a rope and had a boatman waiting underneath the. So it helped the priest escape, and then she was charged with that, and again martyred. So these wonderful women, again, they're very, very special to me.
So what I'd like to ask a little bit more is, what are some? I want to talk a little bit more about some some of the great saints here. I think John Southworth.
Yep.
Is it also Southwell? Robert Southwell, is that right?
Yeah, Robert Southwell. Yeah. You can argue with people about whether you pronounce his name Southwell or Southwell.
Okay,
but either way, it's spelt Southwell.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. But before we do, I'd love to. What are some lessons that you think? I think sometimes people are so afraid of, and not that. Obviously persecution is awful, but Christians are persecuted in many regimes around the world today, and they have been, right? And so what are some lessons that we as Catholics today, should learn from this?
Well, the first thing I think we should learn is humility, because we don't know whether we would have their courage if we found ourselves in their position. We certainly shouldn't presume that we would, because we might not.
Amen.
So the first thing is that we should on our knees in humility look up to them in awe at the courage and faith that sustained them through this suffering and torture and execution and years of imprisonment in some cases. So that's the first thing. But also, of course, they're exemplifying the journey that Christ tells us to take. We must take up our cross. We must die to ourselves on a daily basis. So they are exemplifying Christ. They're following in his footsteps, and on the Via Dolorosa through the crucifixion, and then, of course, to the glorious resurrection. So in that, we can see, if you like, the face of Christ in the face of these martyrs, and hope that we might be worthy to have the strength and the grace to be as strong as they are by the grace of God, if we find ourselves, heaven forbid, perhaps. Although even then, I see that's a prayer of cowardice, because in many ways, they say the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. That when the church is too comfortable, it becomes corrupt. It's almost as if we need periods of persecution to be periods of purgation, where we actually purge ourselves of our selfishness and understand the purity again of what it is to be a Christian. So I don't have the courage to pray for persecution, but I should at least not be too quick to pray that we shouldn't receive it either.
Yeah. One thing that I often find helpful to remember is the fact that we're going to die. This is so obvious. I think all of us understand this intellectually, but not all of us believe it existentially. And that, I think it's Psalm 90 that says, right, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom, right? Average span of life is 70. For those who are strong, it's 80, and 70 to 80 years. It's like, even though that was written 3,000 years ago, it's not that different. And in that deep sense that okay, yes, I certainly, and I think just kind of remembering that seems to me to be something that I think the martyrs remind us of, which is that we're not going to hold on to this world either way.
Yep.
You're not going to outsmart a tyrant, and either way you're going to die. And so kind of that sense that, but also maybe either way you're going to live if you can stay faithful to Christ. And in a way just be kind of inspired, recognizing that they're on our team. They're not judging us. They're praying for us. You can even see many of that sense that, and those martyrs prayed for not only their persecutors, but all the fellow Christians who were weak, and who, apostatized, or who were weak and, capitulated and, left the Catholic Church. Right. And I think that's a kind of a noble thing, is to remember that, they're on our side. Christ is on our side. Mary's on our side. All the great martyrs are on our side. And so, right, we don't have to do this life alone.
Right. And they're alive, right?
Yes.
Even though they've died. And that's key. I mean, great literature and the lives of the martyrs and the example of the martyrs provide us with that necessary memento mori, that necessary reminder of death, the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, or hell. And when you get to my age, Michael, you'll find out sooner or later. When you get to my age, it's very easy to keep your eye on the finishing line. I'm almost looking forward to death. I mean, it's only because I still have a son and daughter, and a daughter who's 17, just going off to college. I would like at least her to graduate before I move on. But I certainly have my eye on the finishing line. I know that I just want to be a good and faithful servant, to run the race, and then by the grace of God, to win the award.
That's great. Well, when we come back, I want to dive into a few more of these great stories and these great living saints who are interceding for us right now and worshiping, right, God at the heavenly altar. And also want to thank our sponsor for this episode, Ignatius Press. IgnatiusPress.com, and your book particularly here, Faith of Our Fathers, A History of True England. And also thank another one of our sponsors, Catholic Mass Times app, the orange icon app. Please go to it. You can download it. You can find it at CatholicMassTimes.com. It's the most widely used app in the world for this purpose. So thank you.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
Welcome back to the Catholic Theology Show. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and we're joined today by Joseph Pearce, and we're discussing, the great martyrs, the great English martyrs, looking at your book, Faith of Our Fathers, A True History of True England.
Yeah, so again, this is the key thing. I want to just remind people that this is a history of true England. Obviously, England, like every country, has good and bad, but the true England is the England that's remained true to the Catholic faith. And we're looking at the period of the 3 centuries where England officially was divorced from the Catholic faith, but where ordinary Englishmen remained true under intense periods of persecution.
Now, also I should add, I think I said IgnatiusPress.com, or Ignatius Press is at Ignatius.com. So for those who want to take a look at the book, your book, or many of the other books that Ignatius Press offers, Ignatius.com. So when I was actually in England and London a few years ago, I said I was there on the feast of John Fisher and Thomas More, but I was there. I think there was it was John Southworth. I can't remember if if his body was going to be coming there or it was stored there or something. And as somewhat of an American, I don't know all these stories as well as I ought to. But so walk us through who was John Southworth, and this is, I think, certainly a later stage in the history of the martyrs.
Yeah. So first of all, you don't have to beat yourself up too much, Michael, about not knowing about the English martyrs. If I didn't know about the English martyrs, then that would be a problem. But you're an American and you don't necessarily need to know, which is why I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share some of these stories with your viewers. But yes, so John Southworth came to the end. So basically, the period of execution was from the 1530s to the 1680s, and he was right near the end, one of the last to be martyred. And yes, you in Westminster Cathedral, they actually have his body in a glass case, so you can actually see it with a death mask on it. And it's rather gruesome. What happened? He suffered the fate of most of these martyrs of being hanged, drawn, and quartered, which is a slow and horrible way to die. I can't give all the gory details. Those that have a morbid imagination can look it up, but it's not a good way to die. So that it involved decapitation, and also then cutting the remainder of the body into 4 parts. That's the quartering. The drawing is actually removing the internal organs while the person's still alive. So that's normally what kills them, the heart being taken out or something. But I think it was the French ambassador managed to get the body, because normally the bodies were just burned, maybe put on spikes around the town to warn people, and then eventually just be burned. But they retrieved the 5 parts of the body and stitched it back together again. And I think it went to France. And then when things got better in England, Westminster Cathedral was built at the turn of the 20th century. His remains were brought back, and now he's there on display. And so the relic, the shrine to St. John Southwell is a place I like to go to and pray for his intercession when I'm in London.
Yeah. And so what was his story?
Well, he was a priest, and again, towards the end, the executions were more rare. They were happening still, but not in the way they were under Elizabeth and James. But he was just a faithful priest that was then arrested, stayed true to the faith, and refused to recant, because all you had to do was recant, and you were freed. But so basically, to say to remain a Catholic guaranteed your death. And he remained faithful and suffered the death of so many others, same death as many others.
Yeah. Let's go to another one, this Robert Southwell.
Yes. Well, he's a Jesuit, and sort of part of that Jesuit wave under the reign of Queen Elizabeth. So Edmund Campion came over in 1580. St. Robert Southwell came up over at the end of the 1580s. And unlike St. Edmund Campion, he managed to evade capture. And what I love, one of the things I love about him, in those days it's low tech. So really, the further you are from London, the safer you are, right? But St. Robert Southwell ministered in the heart of the beast. So he was based in London. He was the personal confessor of the Earl of Southampton, who was the patron of William Shakespeare. So in the late 1580s, early 1590s, until his arrest in 1592, it's about the time that Shakespeare's beginning to write in London. I think they probably knew each other. Can't prove that, but we do know that Shakespeare refers to Robert Southwell's poetry. I should mention, Robert Southwell was a best-selling poet. This was before the age of the novel. The best-selling authors were poets, and even Queen Elizabeth I was familiar with Robert Southwell's poetry. He wrote some wonderful pious poetry upon the image of death, The Burning Babe, a very famous Christmas poem. But there's a poem he wrote in the first person, the voice of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was executed, a Catholic queen executed by Elizabeth on the orders of Elizabeth I. And in that, the imagery of Elizabeth, Mary saying that in being crushed, my fragrance will rise to heaven like incense, and I will be as God's spice. And at the end of the King Lear, in the King Lear, the "Come, let's away to prison" scene with Cordelia, he says, "Come, let's away to prison, and we will be God's spies." And the thing about the Jesuits, they were both God's spies because they had to be undercover. They were gardeners or teachers by day and priests undercover. That's the way it had to be. So they were God's spies who became, upon arrest, God's spies, crushed and fragrance rising to heaven. And then the famous graveyard scene in Hamlet is a dialogue with certain stanzas from Robert Southwell's poem upon the image of death, references to Alexander the Great and Caesar. So this very, very interesting, well-known poet, and he's arrested in 1592, tortured repeatedly for 3 years. And there's actually a report by one of Queen Elizabeth's torturers that they had this new torture device. I don't exactly know the details of it, but it involved hanging people from the wall. And nobody had ever managed to resist interrogation with this device. And I have seen Southwell hanging there, and we can get nothing out of him. So he's a great, courageous man. Then his final words when as he's being hanged, drawn, and quartered, well, he gave a speech before. You can't start speaking once you're getting that happening to you. But his famous words were, in Manners to us, into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. So the words of Christ on the cross. I mean, it's just one of my, he's personal, because he's a writer, and an English martyr, and I'm a writer and not an English martyr, but I am English. I've sort of adopted him as my personal patron. So if I sound enthusiastic, it's because I am.
That's great. And it's Southwell, right? Is not how it's pronounced, but how it's written.
People argue. I was at a conference in London where one of his descendants, whose name was Southwell, and he pronounced his name Southwell, but I was always told prior to that it was pronounced Southwell.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Well, no, I think it's good. But just that way, for people who might want to look it up, though, it's a great gift. And just, tell me a little bit more also, when he's a famous author and poet, right, is that as a Catholic?
Oh, yes.
Or as a Jesuit?
Oh yes, he's a bit like Robin Hood. I mean, he's an outlaw. They know he's in England. They don't know where he is. His poems are being published illegally and disseminated and very widely known. Say, we know that Queen Elizabeth I was familiar with his poetry. So he's like a Scarlet Pimpernel, Robin Hood figure who's a best-selling author who's going to be killed as soon as he's arrested. Well, after being tortured.
That's great. Well, also, by the way, I want to just step outside for a moment and just ask our staff here if there's a chance that they can look up and figure out when exactly is the feast of John. So when is the feast? When are the feast of these English martyrs, and then also when is the feast of John Fisher and Thomas More? So anyway, when Anthony has a chance, Anthony will let us know, and we'll share that with our audience. While we're looking at that. There's a great story you were mentioning of St. Nicholas Owen, who used his craftsmanship to help sustain the church.
Yeah, so he's another wonderful saint. So he, apparently a small man and a little bit deformed, so not a strapping person, but a great carpenter and a great stonemason. So he went around the country building priest holes. So basically, many of these recusant houses, recusants were those Catholics who refused to conform to the state religion and were persecuted in consequence. And many of these larger recusant houses, they built really elaborate priest holes. I've visited several of them, and Nicholas Owen built most of these. And in many ways, he'd build ones that were deliberately relatively easy to discover, and then one that was much more hidden. So they did the search, they discover the priest hole, seen though a priest was in there, and then got the search where there's another priest hole. It's a bit more difficult to find. So really elaborate, really clever. I've actually clambered down into some of these and sang the Salve Regina or something just as to be in communion with the priest. But we also St. Nicholas Owen. He was arrested. He was tortured. They obviously wanted from him. He knew where all these priest holes were, and they knew he was the person that built them, and they couldn't get any information from him about where they are. And they're still discovering priest holes today when they renovate homes. It's his legacy is still there to be seen. People go on a pilgrimage to England. One of the things I would recommend is to visit the priest holes.
Wow. So walk us through one, by the way.
Well, my favourite is, because my favourite part of England where I lived is Norfolk, which where the Shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham is. So it's a very special place. But there's Oxborough Hall, and that's a recusant family called the Bedingfeld family that stayed loyal to the faith for all these centuries of persecution. And there's actually a flagstone, and I think it was originally somehow connected to a toilet or something, not any longer, but it pulls up and there's just enough room to get down into it. And then once you're into it, there's enough room for probably about 2 or 3 people to sit. You can't stand, but you can sit. It was a special place to me. I must admit, last time I went there, my experience was that it seems to have got smaller, but I think it's probably because I'm getting bigger.
Wow, that's really amazing. And so there would have been, for a priest to be in there would have been also very, would have been difficult as well to spend however long one has to be in a place where you can't stand up, right? This was even, the sacrifices that they were making.
And sometimes for days on end, because if the priest hunters on good authority know that there's a priest there, a spy witness, for instance, they know he's here. And it might be days. So they put food down when the priest is staying there in case. But that one's out, and it could well be going 2 or 3 days in pitch darkness with no food, probably running out of water. It was a miserable place to be, but it saved many lives.
Yeah, and continued to spread the faith,
Indeed.
which is really powerful. There's another saint, another Nicholas, right? This is one of the beatified, martyrs, Blessed Nicholas Postgate, but I don't think it's pronounced Postgate. It's Postgate.
Postgate. We don't pronounce the T.
Okay. Nicholas Postgate.
Yeah. So what I like about him is, unlike some of these priests that are arrested almost as soon as they land, sometimes literally as soon as they get off the boat, he was ministering to the Catholics in the Yorkshire moors, so the wild sort of countryside, for about 60 or so years. And there's a list of how many marriages that he's writing to his superior in Rome, how many marriages he'd conducted, how many converts received into the church, all of this sort of register of what a priest does over this period of decades. And eventually he's betrayed. And he's, I think, around 80 years old at this point. And he's dragged through York on a hurdle, behind a horse, and then also suffers this gruesome death by hanging, drawing, and quartering. So no mercy even to an old man. But I love the fact that, and if you go to the North Yorkshire moors, which is in itself a very romantic part of England, you can go to, there's a cross out in the middle of the moors, which is where he preached, and then there's a church that has his relics in, and so that's again another good place to go on a pilgrimage if you're there. And I'm pleased we mentioned that, because say the 85 beatified martyrs, the blesseds rather than saints, tend to get overlooked, and he's a favorite of mine.
That's great. By the way, Anthony, were you able to figure out the date? Okay, so June 22nd is the feast of Thomas More and John Fisher. So you said you have 150 years, around 1680 or so, 1530 to 1680 of executions, then another 150 years of persecution. So around 1830, or is it 1829?
Catholic emancipation is 1829, yeah.
1829. So in 1829, there's a young man who's teaching at Oxford as a professor, John Henry Newman. And I think many people, now a doctor of the church, recently beatified, declared a saint, and now a doctor of the church by Pope Leo, and we know he converts to the Catholic faith in 1845, right, which is only 15 years after the emancipation. So he grew up. He becomes a professor, I think, at Oriel College, and I think when he was 21. So he was a bit of a wunderkind, a prodigy, right, and. At that time, so he's already spending kind of the first decade of his professoriate working to revivify the Church of England by fostering the Oxford movement. And yet he ends up, he says in 1843, he's on his deathbed with respect to Anglicanism. It still takes him 2 more years to become a Catholic. And so tell us a little bit about this, but he eventually will describe something like the Catholic Church in England as a second spring, this rebirth of Catholicism in England in the second half of the 19th century. Kind of walk us through that period.
Yeah, I'm really pleased that you've done this, Michael, because by the time of Catholic emancipation, the early 1800s, the Catholic Church had not been killed, but you're down to a few tens of thousands of these very loyal, heroic Catholic families that have stayed loyal to the faith for 300 years of persecution. But then we have this Catholic revival. And Newman, of course, is absolutely at the forefront of it. There are other factors, but in my book covering this period, I look at the number of Catholic churches in England in 1829. It was illegal to have Catholic churches in England until after Catholic emancipation. You have all these new churches being built. You also have Catholic schools being opened. And if you look at the figures for the number of Catholic churches, minimal, normally attached to embassies in England in the 1820s. And then look at the end of the century, and we're talking about hundreds, and the number of Catholics, manifold, the number of Catholic schools, the number of Catholic students at schools. I mean, the figures are astonishing. What we see here is a resurrection, and Christ spent 3 days in the tomb. England spent 3 centuries, but it rose again from the dead, and it's largely thanks to St. John Henry Newman. We have this great Catholic revival, and lots of converts. Chesterton, of course, Monsignor Ronald Knox, J.R. Tolkien as a child, his mother converted. We could go on and on and on. And this great Catholic revival, which we see in the 19th and 20th centuries, a consequence of Newman and that Second Spring, a wonderful title. England was experiencing the Second Spring, and I think that was given in connection with the reestablishment of the Catholic hierarchy in England in 1850.
Yeah, and I think it's Francis Faber, is that right? He and Newman were fellow Oratorians, and they were actually both so such strong leaders that they parted ways and founded their own oratories. So there was an oratory, this is under St. Philip Neri, but an oratory that was in London, which was Father Faber's, and then the oratory in Birmingham, right, became Newman's. And and I think the two of them, right, in two different ways. I think Father Faber, to my knowledge, was much more kind of get out there and tell the Protestants they ought to come home.
Yeah.
Right. To the Catholic Church and kind of be on the street and be arguing. And Newman's way was kind of recognizing that, truth took time to change. A lot of his family members didn't become Catholic. I don't think any of his family members became Catholic, to my knowledge. And I think one of them became an agnostic. His sister was a very devout, evangelical Anglican. But that really caused him a lot of pain. And so, and it's kind of interesting. And both of those together kind of helped, as a whole, I think kind of like, recognize that there are different ways of representing, the Catholic faith to the English.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Father Faber as well, because my book, Faith of Our Fathers, that hymn, Father Faber wrote that hymn.
Yeah.
So that there's a good connection there. We shouldn't forget Cardinal Manning as well, who was another giant figure of the 19th century, very influential. Possibly, but people think he was influential upon Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, so impacted the global church in that sense. And as regards different types of approach to, should we say, evangelization, I love Ronald Knox, again, a convert. He says there are two types of Catholics. He said there are the hooks and the crooks. There's the hooks of the fisherman, the crooks of the shepherd. He said, I'm more of a crook than a hook. So you have those who really are more concerned with feeding the flock, with looking after the church and making sure that Catholics are fed and nourished with the faith, and others that want to go out there and win converts. Of course, there are others that do both, but both are legitimate paths to heaven.
Yeah. So how does Frank Sheed in the 20th century is, I think some people know of Frank Sheed. Sheed and Ward was a major Catholic publishing house. And Frank Sheed is a beautiful book, to know, I think, Christ Jesus, as well as a short book on, the Ignatius Press actually publishes a lot of Frank Sheed's works, a map of life on the Creed, right? Could you tell us a little bit about Frank Sheed and his impact on 20th century Catholicism?
Yeah, so Frank Sheed's actually an Australian who moved to England and married Maisie Ward, who's, amongst other things, the biographer of G.K. Chesterton, the first great biography of Chesterton. But they formed the Catholic Evidence Guild, and they would literally set up a box at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park and get up and start preaching the faith, and they be heckled by Marxists and what have you. And then, of course, our outreach of that was to found this publishing house, Sheed and Ward, and they were probably the most dynamic Catholic publishers in English language for the first half of the 20th century and beyond. Great figure, great champion. I love a story about the Catholic Evidence Guild, as you put it up. There's a wonderful priest, Dominican priest, Father Vincent McNabb, who was a friend of Chesterton. Chesterton said of Father Vincent McNabb that he walks on a crystal floor above my head. So that's how Chesterton. But he was a great agrarian, a distributist, that we need to get back to a simpler form of life. And he was giving a talk about going back to the land. And this sort of Marxist sort of heckled him and said, well, exactly how should we go back to the land? And he said, on foot. Because he was very much he used to walk. Yeah. He used to walk sort of 7 or 8 miles to that and then walk back again. He was very much a technominimus. It's a man after my own heart.
That's really great. So, so many beautiful things to think about that, and I think right now there's even I don't remember what it was, but I remember hearing a little bit that that I'm trying to remember if it was like there were more Catholics attending Mass than Anglicans in England today.
It's the largest Christian denomination by far now. And the other very interesting thing, last Easter and this last Christmas, records are being broken of the number of people attending Mass. And the really interesting thing, the demographic is 18 to 25-year-olds. So there's just this astonishing rediscovery of I just hope that the hierarchy, we were talking about St. John Fisher and the other bishops, I just hope the hierarchy have the courage to witness, because as Chesterton says, we don't want a church that will move with the world. We want a church that will move the world. And these people are interested in the Catholic faith because they don't like the way the world's moving. They want to find something which is showing them the truth. And we need a church that's going to have the courage to show that to them.
Yeah. Kind of really going back to that, that line that we mentioned in another podcast, but that sense of Gustav Mahler, right? The tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of a fire. And in this case here, we really saw how the English martyrs preserved that fire, that flame of Christ, that flame of apostolic succession, the flame of, right, the actual flame that basically is at the tabernacle, like the tabernacle candle, that flame that's at every Mass, and kind of a beautiful story.
The other thing that's wonderful about this flame, this if you like, you see it in two ways. The English martyrs carried that flame for those 300 years or 150 years of executions. But the other flame they have, they've carried to heaven, right? And that flame burns. It's a more powerful flame. So in their death is their resurrection. And it's as saints that they have much more power than they had when they were actually priests ministering on the streets of England.
Yeah. And it's a wonderful way, too, to show how the hierarchy and the laity, the priests and religious, and the families sustained the faith, because here this is clearly, it was the families that held the house, that had the houses under great persecution, under financial ruin, under taxes, under very obviously, if you get caught, you're not going to get off if you get caught with a priest, right? And this great kind of cooperation of the laity working with the priests and religious that sustained the faith, both through the executions, the persecution, and then the little bit of this renewal.
Yeah, and this is, to me, this is the most heroic episode in English history. I mean, the Catholic England for 1,500 years is a glorious, merry England. We look back at medieval England is glorious. But for me, the most heroic chapter in English history is staying true to the faith through these centuries of persecution.
Right, and now as we are in the day we have, right, the day we have is to try to foster and continue it. And glad to see all the work you are doing to help connect. And it is fascinating to see. Often I just find reading a lot of 20th century books in Catholic theology and Catholic spiritual writing, and it's just interesting how often you'll notice it was London. And this a lot of the great Benedictines, we have Blackfriars, the Dominicans in Oxford, the Grey Friars, right? Who are the Franciscans who were there, and just anyway. So a lot of it's there anyway. It was a seed that kind of really has had a great influence on Catholic life in the United States.
Yep.
Yeah, which really kind of and it's beautiful to kind of recognize our debt to the Catholics of Merry England.
Yes, indeed, and it makes, of course, it's a healthy patriotism. Yeah. If you love your country for the saints she's produced, not the land she's conquered, but the saints she's produced to the glory of God. That's the England, the true England, to which I owe my allegiance.
Well, that's great. So today we were talking about the English martyrs. May they pray for us. And for those who are interested, you can find more about Joseph Pearce at jpearce.co. The book we were talking about in part today was Faith of Our Fathers, A History of True England, published by Ignatius Press. You can find it at ignatius.com. And I also want to thank Ignatius Press for being a sponsor of this episode. So thanks so much, Joseph, for being on the show today.
My pleasure as always. God bless you, Michael.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.